Have you ever thought about how a war from more than 150 years ago still affects the way people live in the United States today? The American Civil War wasn't just a fight between the North and the South. It was a turning point that changed what freedom, equality, and national identity meant. This video shows how the Civil War has had long-lasting effects on many areas of our lives. From the civil rights movement to the way our government is set up. What role did this huge battle play in making America what it is today? Keep watching to find out. The Civil War shaped American society and politics more than any other event. It was the most devastating event for any American generation. The conflict killed at least 620,000 soldiers, 2% of the U.S. population in 1861. If the same percentage of Americans were slain in a conflict today, the deaths would reach 6 million. At the Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862, 4 times as many Americans were killed and wounded as at Normandy on June 6, 1944. On that September day at Sharpsburg, Maryland, more Americans were killed in combat than in all other U.S. wars of the 19th century combined. How might this conflict happen? Why did Americans attack one another like no other Western nation between the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 and the start of World War I in 1914? The Mexican-American War, fought 15 years earlier, sparked the Civil War. The dispute over whether slavery could expand into the 700,000 square miles of former Mexican territory acquired by the U.S. in 1848 divided Americans for a decade. Northern congressmen passed the Wilmot Proviso, which banned slavery in all Mexican territories. Southern senatorial power overturned this proviso. Instead, South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun introduced many resolutions upholding slaveholders' constitutional right to transport their slave property into any U.S. territory. These disagreements set the tone for the next decade. After discovering gold in California in 1848, 80,000 49ers formed a state government and petitioned Congress to admit it as the 31st state. Southerners fiercely opposed this request because California's new constitution outlawed slavery. In 1850, the nation seemed held together by a thread, with war between free and slave states a dangerous possibility. They threatened secession if they were denied their right to take slaves into California and other territories acquired from Mexico. Senator Henry S. Foote of Mississippi brandished a loaded revolver during a debate, and Jefferson Davis challenged an Illinois congressman to a duel. However, the Compromise of 1850 ended the violence by admitting California as a free state, dividing the rest of the Mexican cession into New Mexico and Utah, and leaving it to their residents to decide if they wanted slavery. A political cartoon shows Mississippi Senator Henry S. Foote threatening Senator Thomas Hart Benton. The Library of Congress cartoon shows Mississippi Senator Henry S. Foote menacing Senator Thomas Hart Benton with a gun during debating the Compromise of 1850. However, the Compromise of 1850 gave the South a severe new fugitive slave legislation that allowed federal marshals, backed by the Army, to collect slaves who had flowed into free states. These measures delayed but did not prevent a final showdown. The fugitive slave law angered many Northerners who had to watch black people, some of whom had lived in their communities for years, return in chains to slavery. Southern anxiety grew as settlers poured into Northern territories that were sure to join the Union as free states, tipping the sectional balance of power against the South in Congress and the Electoral College. Southerners wanted to buy Cuba from Spain and gain more Central American territory. Private armies of filibusters, mostly Southerners, tried to invade Cuba and Nicaragua to overthrow their governments and bring them into the U.S. as slave states. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 and the subsequent guerrilla war between pro- and anti-slavery partisans in Kansas Territory were the events that most divided North and South. The Louisiana Purchase, acquired by the U.S. from France in 1803, was divided at latitude 36 degrees 30 in 1820 by the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise, considered inviolable by Northerners, lasted 34 years until 1854, when Southerners forced Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, chairman of the Senate Committee on Territories, to repeal the ban on slavery north of 36 degrees 30 in exchange for Southern support for the formal organization of Kansas and Nebraska territories. Douglas expected that caving to Southern pressure would raise a hell of a storm in the North, but it brought down many Northern Democrats and created the Republican Party, which promised to end slavery in Kansas and all other territories. The new party's eloquent leader was Illinois lawyer Abraham Lincoln, who believed that there can be no moral right in the enslaving of one man by another. Lincoln and other Republicans recognized that the U.S. Constitution protected slavery in the states where it already existed, but they wanted to stop its expansion before ending it. At the start of his famous 1858 Senate campaign against Douglas, Lincoln declared, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free." Lincoln hoped to place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate. Lincoln lost the senatorial election in 1858, but 2 years later, he won the presidency by winning every northern state against a Democratic Party split into northern and southern factions. It was the first time in more than a generation that the South had lost effective control of the national government. Southerners saw the handwriting on the wall. At Montgomery, Alabama, delegates from those 7 states established the Constitution for the Confederate States of America and formed a new government under Jefferson Davis before Lincoln assumed office on March 4, 1861. These states took most forts, arsenals, and other federal property inside their borders as they seceded, except for Fort Sumter and Charleston Harbor. The United States had already dissolved when Lincoln took his oath to preserve, protect, and defend the U.S. and its Constitution. 6 weeks later, 4 additional slave states seceded when Confederate militia fired on Fort Sumter, starting Civil War. Lincoln and most Northerners refused to accept the constitutional legitimacy of secession, the central idea pervading this struggle. Lincoln declared in May 1861, "is the necessity that is upon us, of proving that popular government is not an absurdity." In his second inaugural address 4 years later, Lincoln said that one side in the 1861 controversy would make war rather than let the nation survive. The other would accept war rather than let it perish. War ensued. The 4-year conflict preserved and transformed the nation. Creating a nation that taxed people directly created an internal revenue bureau to collect taxes, drafted men into the army, increased federal court powers, created a national currency, and in 5 years, the first 3 post-war amendments abolished slavery, 13th, and granted former slaves equal citizenship, 14th, and voting rights, 15th, the most radical and rapid social and political change in American history. This transformation of more than 4 million slaves into citizens with equal rights became the central issue of the troubled 12-year Reconstruction period after the Civil War. After 50 years, the civil rights movement revived the promises of the 1860s, culminating in 2008 with the election of an African-American president who took the oath of office with his hand on Abraham Lincoln's Bible. Slaveholders from states that joined the Confederacy served as presidents of the United States for 49 of 72 years, more than 2/3 of the time. 23 of the 36 speakers of the House and 24 of the presidents pro tem of the Senate were Southerners. The Supreme Court always had a Southern majority before the Civil War. For half a century after the war, only 1 Speaker of the House and no Senate President pro tem were from the South, and only 5 of the 26 Supreme Court justices were Southerners. Lincoln's wartime speeches marked this transition. In his first inaugural address, he mentioned the Union 20 times, but not the nation. The Civil War settled 2 major issues left unanswered by the American Revolution and Constitution. First was whether this new republic born in a world of kings, emperors, tyrants, and oligarchs could survive. The Republican experiment launched in 1776 was fragile, and the Founding Fathers were painfully aware that most republics had been overthrown by revolutions or collapsed into anarchy or dictatorship. Some Americans alive in 1860 had twice seen French republics fall to revolution. At Gettysburg, Lincoln spoke of a new birth of freedom. He was referring to slavery, another issue left unresolved by the Revolution of 1776. The Civil War ended slavery. Antebellum Americans boasted that their land of liberty was a beacon light of freedom to oppress peoples abroad. The antebellum era saw 2 socioeconomic and cultural systems compete for dominance in the U.S. body politic: an agricultural society based on slavery and an entrepreneurial capitalist society based on free labor. Although free labor capitalism seems inevitable in retrospect, it was not clear at the time. The rural, agricultural, plantation South, with its strict system of racial caste and slave labor, dominated the U.S. government for most of that time, and the slave states' territory far exceeded that of the free states. and the Southern drive for further territorial expansion seemed more aggressive than the North's. The Civil War shaped modern America, for better or worse. In 1865, a plantation society and slave system that had dominated half the country before 1861 collapsed, replaced by free labor entrepreneurial capitalism. In 1873, Mark Twain wrote that the Civil War cataclysm uprooted institutions that were centuries old, changed the politics of a people, and wrought so profoundly upon the entire national character that the influence cannot be measured short of 2 or 3 generations. 5 generations later, we are still measuring its effects. Don't miss out on more deep dives into the pivotal moments that shaped our world. Subscribe now and stay informed with every new video.